This is the story of Paul Bunyan and the Laughing River. Once, long, long ago, in the big north woods, there lived a man named Paul Bunyan. He was a giant of a man, so big that he was born in 4 states at once. So big that when he stood straight and tall, the clouds bumped into his head. So big that when he walked in front of the sun, his shadow fell across the earth and made it look like supper time all the way from Maine to Michigan.
Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tall as a mountain top was he. Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tough and strong as a man could be.
Well, Paul was a logger. He chopped down trees so that people would have wood to make things out of. Things like houses and schools and barns and ships. Up in the North Woods in those days, there were so many trees to cut that not even Paul Bunyan could cut them all by himself. So he got himself a great crew of lumberjacks to work with him. They were big men, rough and tough and strong, but none of them was as big or rough or tough or strong as their boss, Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tall as a mountain top was he. Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tough and strong as a man could be. Way up in the North Woods long ago, way up in the woods where the big trees grow, there lived a man a mile tall. That was the man they used to call Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tall as a mountain top was he. Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tough and strong as a man could be. With his mighty hands, his ox and axe, Paul was the boss of the lumberjacks, strong as a bull and a mile tall. The mightiest lumberjack of all was Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tall as a mountain top was he. Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tough and strong as a man could be. Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tall as a mountain top was he. Paul Bunyan, big Paul Bunyan, tough and strong as a man could be.
Now, in Paul Bunyan's day, there were no such things as trucks or tractors or machines that could carry those big logs out of the forest. So how do you think the lumberjacks got them miles away to the sawmills? They used the rivers. Logs can float, so Paul, with the help of his horses and oxen, hauled the logs out of the forest to the nearest river. Into the water they went, and the current of the river carried them downstream to the sawmill. There were some pretty good rivers, too, straight and wide with a good strong current, just perfect for floating logs on. Until, one year up in Michigan, Paul Bunyan met up with the Laughing River. That year, Paul and his lumberjacks found a forest of magnificent pine trees, tall, big, straight, strong, just perfect for making things out of. Well, Paul and his boys got so excited about finding these trees that they set up camp quick as a rabbit and went out into the forest to start cutting them down. Chop, 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 chop. Chop, 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 chop. Chop, 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 chop. Chop, 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 chop. 1, 2, 3, chopping and chipping and axing. Paul and his boys chopped 23,000 trees that first morning, and all before breakfast. Then Paul turned to his men and said, Boys, that was a good morning's work. Let's haul these logs down to the river, and then we'll just relax a bit and have a good, hearty breakfast together. Oh, boy, said Axel, the axeman. Axel loved to eat almost as much as he loved to chop trees. Breakfast? Can we have cereal, and eggs, and steak, and pancakes, and rolls, and milk, and coffee, and everything? Yes, said Paul, everything, after we get these logs to the river. So the loggers hitched up the oxen and the horses, and they hauled those 23,000 logs out of the woods down to the river in just 34 minutes and 8 seconds flat. And once they had done that much, with the logs all stacked up by the river's edge, they sat down in the sunshine to enjoy the fresh, quiet, cool beauty of morning in the North Woods. There's nothing like it. You ought to see it, especially this time of year. The streams are running cold and clear up in the Northland this time of year. The birds sing sweet songs they want you to hear. Up in the Northland this time of year, the pines and hemlock trees stand straight and tall. The wind in the forest seems to be calling. The woods are waiting for you to be here. Up in the Northland this time of year. The pines and hemlock trees stand straight and tall. The wind in the forest seems to be calling. The woods are waiting for you to be here. Up in the Northland this time of year. Well, Paul Bunyan looked at the river, and suddenly he looked puzzled, as if he had just noticed something strange. "What's the matter, Paul?" asked Axel. Paul didn't answer. Instead, he picked up one of the giant logs and tossed it into the water. The log floated there for a second, and then rushed away downstream with the current. But 2 seconds later, it reappeared, bouncing right back upstream to where Paul was. Then the log swirled around and around and around, and all of a sudden, the river, with a mighty gurgle, picked up the log and threw it back onto the shore at Paul's feet. Paul looked as if maybe he was getting mad. He bent down, picked up another log, and tossed it into the river. And once again, down it floated, back it came, and the river, with another gurgling, bubbling sound that sounded a lot like someone laughing, to Paul. Paul was getting madder. "What kind of river is this?" one of Paul's lumberjacks said. "Well, Mr. Bunyan, I'll bet you that this is the famous talk about loggers like us, because we can never float our logs anywhere on it. Throw in another log and see if I'm right." Paul tried once more, and sure enough, the log headed downstream a few feet, Then the river twisted and turned and zigged and zagged and went around and around in big circles and little circles, and all of a sudden, back the log came, back to where it had started. And once more, with that same gurgling and bubbling sound that sounded like laughter, the river threw the log back to Paul. And Paul Bunyan realized that the river was laughing at him. "No river is going to laugh at me," he said. And he picked up 45 logs all at once and threw them into the river. And the river threw them all right back at him, laughing at him all the while. Well, Paul Bunyan was mad. And when Paul Bunyan got mad, he stamped around and stomped around so that the whole earth shook and trembled, and even the sun hid frightened behind a cloud. "Now calm down, Mr. Bunyan," said Axel. "Don't let it get to you. Now calm down, Mr. Bunyan. It's a breakfast time, ain't it?" "No river is going to laugh at me," Paul yelled. And then he realized that his lumberjacks hadn't had their breakfast yet. "Well, you're right, Axel. You need your breakfast. Come on, let's go back to camp." Well, back to camp they all went, and everyone had a great big breakfast, just like Axel wanted. Lots of hot cereal and eggs and steak and pancakes and rolls and milk and coffee. But Paul Bunyan didn't eat a thing. He just sat there, still mad. "Laugh at me, will it? No river is going to laugh at me. No twisting, turning, zigging, zagging river is going to make a fool out of Paul Bunyan. I'm going to have to teach that river a lesson. I'm going to have to straighten out that river." "Straighten it out? Well, of course, that's exactly what I'll do. I'll straighten it out. I'll straighten it out and get rid of all of those twists and turns and zigs and zags." And he laughed and laughed and laughed so hard that the earth jumped and trembled again, and the sun went back behind its cloud just for safety. Then Paul shouted, "Bring me Babe." Now, Babe was Paul Bunyan's big blue ox. Babe was the strongest, biggest ox in the whole wide world. So strong that he could pull the earth around the sky if he was asked to. So big that when an eagle flew from one of Babe's horns to the other, it took from Thanksgiving to the 4th of July just to make the trip. Big? You don't know what big is until you see Babe, the big blue ox. Big Babe, well, I'll bet my socks you never saw anything like Babe, the big blue ox. Now, Babe, he was so big, sir, his back reached to the sky. He had to go lie down, sir, to let the clouds go by. Big Babe, well, I'll bet my socks you never saw anything like Babe, the big blue ox. This ox, it was so big, sir, that when he had to sneeze, 100 ships in the China Sea were capsized by the breeze. Yes, it's Big Babe, well, I'll bet my socks you never saw anything like Babe, the big blue ox. His voice, it was so big, sir, that when he had to cough, the force went round the world, sir, and knocked the North Pole off. Yes, it's Big Babe, well, I'll bet my socks you never saw anything like Babe, the big blue ox. The horns upon his head, sir, they reached up to the moon. A man went up in January, didn't come down till June. Yes, it's Big Babe, well, I'll bet my socks you never saw anything like Babe, the big blue ox. Yes, it's Big Babe, well, I'll bet my socks you never saw anything like Babe, the big blue ox. Babe was brought to Paul Bunyan. "Babe," said Paul, "we have a job to do. We're going to straighten out that zigzag, twisting, turning, laughing river." Well, Paul and his loggers had some big chains that they used to haul the logs. Paul took 22 of these chains and braided them all together into one big, strong chain. Then he took Babe and the chain down to the river. He hitched one end of the chain to Babe's harness and hitched the other end to the river. "Okay, Babe," he said. "Now pull. Pull that river straight." Babe pulled. Now a river, of course, is full of water and it's mighty slippery. So as soon as Babe started to pull, the harness slid right off the river and landed on the ground. Paul tried the same thing a few times, but of course the harness just slid right off every time. And the river gurgled and bubbled and laughed all the harder. And as the river laughed and laughed and laughed, Paul got madder and madder and madder. "So that's the way you want to play, is it? All right, laughing river. I know how to get around you and your slippery, watery wetness." Paul bent down with his head close to the river, and he started to blow on it the way you blow on soup when you want to cool it off. Well, the minute Paul started to blow, the temperature on the river dropped 50 degrees. The birds felt the temperature change, and they thought that winter was coming, so they flew away south to the sunshine. But the river kept flowing and gurgling and bubbling and laughing. Paul blew harder, and the temperature dropped 50 more degrees. Snow started to fall, and ice formed on the river. But the river still kept flowing and gurgling and bubbling and laughing. Paul blew harder, and the temperature dropped 50 more degrees. It turned colder and colder, so cold that the snowflakes froze together as they fell and formed gigantic snowballs as they came down. So cold that Babe's breath froze as it came out of his mouth, so that Paul had to chop it apart so the ox could breathe. So cold that the sun finally had to put on a sweater and cap to keep from freezing itself. More ice formed on the laughing river, and it started to slow down a little. But still it kept flowing, and from somewhere deep down in its bottom, it managed a funny, little, cold kind of laugh. And Paul Bunyan knew that that laugh was aimed right at him. Well, that was all Paul needed to get really mad. He took one deep, deep breath and gave one final, great, big blow. This time the sky became a sheet of ice. The sun put on a heavy overcoat and earmuffs and went inside. And suddenly, the laughing river stopped laughing and froze solid. Paul quickly wrapped the other end of the chain around the river. "Pull, Babe, pull," he yelled. And Babe pulled and pulled and pulled. But the river fought back, and Babe couldn't straighten it out. Then Paul got alongside Babe and got a hold of the chain with him. And together, 1, 2, 3, they both pulled with a mighty pull. And the river lifted clear out of the riverbed, twirled around in the air, hollered and howled, and fell back on the ground, straight and stiff as can be. Well, that river was finished fighting. Paul took another deep breath and very, very gently blew warm air over the countryside, the way you blow on your hands when you want to warm them up. The air grew warm again. The birds figured that the winter was over and came back up north. The sun came back out and took off his overcoat and his earmuffs and his gloves and his sweater. And the water in the laughing river thawed out, straight as you please. But the river wasn't laughing anymore. It just sort of lay there, quietly catching its breath. Paul took one log and tossed it in, and down it went, downstream, quietly, straight as an arrow, down to the sawmill. Well, the lumberjacks finished up their work that day and moved on. Today, there's not much around to remind you of Paul Bunyan and his fight with the laughing river. The northlands are quiet, the trees have all grown back, and the sun just sits on the mountaintop shining away. But every winter, when the temperature begins to drop, that river, they don't call it the laughing river anymore, that river just gives a little shiver and tries very hard to keep quiet as a mouse. It doesn't want to get into another fight, not with Paul Bunyan. rivers have to gurgle and bubble and laugh just a little bit. It's just the way they are. So if you ever get close to a river or a stream, listen very carefully and you'll hear it. But if you do hear it, please don't tell Big Paul Bunyan. He might get really mad.